We're here with Michael from Engine Yard. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Engine Yard and what you guys do?
Yep, sounds good. So my name is Michael Mullany. I run marketing and product management for Engine Yard. Engine Yard is basically a company that was started about 3 years ago to provide deployment and operations technologies for Ruby on Rails. So Ruby on Rails is a web development framework, probably the iconic web development framework. It was developed by David Hannemeyer Hansen in 2005 and open sourced in 2006. And since then, it's sort of exploded to the point where there's roughly about 500,000 Ruby on Rails developers worldwide today. And Gartner projects that it's going to go to about 3 million by 2013.
So tell me about why you decided to focus on a dedicated infrastructure solution for Ruby. What are the particular challenges that you guys can address for folks running it?
Sure. Well, really what we're trying to offer to customers is basically a divorce from operations, which is kind of you write it, we'll run it. So all people have to do is focus on developing the website, optimizing the user experience, and creating the kind of the craftsmanship of what the site's going to look like, and then they can hand all the infrastructure back to us. I mean, what's happened over the last couple of years is that the technology stack that's running, not necessarily just Rails sites, but kind of Web 2.0 sites in general, has just exploded to the point where there's probably 30 different components that people routinely have to assemble and integrate together to run a real production Ruby on Rails site. That means everything from kind of rack in the front end to Passenger and Mongrel on the application server side to Nginx and Apache on the web server side, MySQL and Postgres on the database side, a whole slew of key value data stores that are becoming popular like Tokyo Cabinet and CouchDB, as well as lots of different varieties of caches, so Memcache for key value caching, Redis for persistent key value caching, as well as things like Rack Cache for HTTP caching on the front end. So it's become enormously complicated to put together a production Web 2.0 site from scratch, and particularly for particularly more brand-focused web development stores that are fantastic on user interface and user experience development, and great at kind of designing presentation logic and business logic. Having to put all those components together in a way that actually scales the site successfully and cost effectively is really challenging. And that's what Engine Yard is in business to do, which is to take the pain of deployment and management of a website and the scaling of a website away from a customer so that they can focus on actually building the best user experience and monetizing it effectively.
There's been some debate, discussion in the community about the ability of Ruby on Rails to scale.
Yep.
How does what you're doing play into that, or how does that is that a challenge or a benefit?
Well, we did a blog post on 5 tips on scaling Ruby on Rails in May. It was one of our most popular blog posts ever. And really the question, it's almost never a question of how do you scale Ruby on Rails, because Ruby on Rails scales just fine. It's really a question of scaling the infrastructure around Ruby on Rails. So you're going to have the exact same challenges scaling a Python-based framework or a Java-based framework. In fact, the scaling problems in Java are probably worse because if you use struts or Hibernate than Ruby on Rails. But stateless application servers like Python Django or Ruby on Rails are other lightweight frameworks. The challenge is usually in scaling the infrastructure and the data tier and the web access, not the actual infrastructure itself. I think there's the number one myth about Ruby on Rails, I think, is, well, Twitter tried it and it didn't work. And in fact, what's the case with Twitter is that the front end of Twitter, the actual application that people use all the time, is still running Ruby on Rails. When you go to the twitter.com website, that is a Ruby on Rails application. It was the back-end message bus that really probably should never have been written in Ruby that was ported to a different language to Erlang.
So tell me about Engine Yard's growth. Obviously, at Data Center Knowledge, we're interested in infrastructure. How has your operation grown since you guys got going?
Sure. So when we started 3 years ago, we started in dedicated data centers. We built up basically our own private cloud for customers. And what we've done most recently is actually ported all our operations expertise, knowledge, and configuration management to the cloud. So now we're actually offering NGR Cloud, which underneath is running on Amazon Web Services, but could be running on any hardware infrastructure cloud. And you can get all the application management, monitoring, and scaling that we, both of our technologies and of our support organization on a cloud infrastructure. And the cloud infrastructure is basically pay as you go and instantly provisionable.
How about in terms of data centers? I understand you guys have
Sure.
some footprint in Sacramento.
Yep.
What's the extent of the data center infrastructure you have in place?
Sure. So
Given that you're using Amazon for some.
Right. So we have 2 data centers for our private cloud business, and from our perspective, there's a class of customers, and when we've done our surveys, there's about a third of our customer base that is more comfortable with more traditional data center locality. I think it's got something to do with the fact that they can actually point to a specific location where their data is, and they would prefer that over sort of the flexibility and pay-as-you-go nature of a modern cloud service. So we have a data center in Sacramento. We also have an East Coast data center, and we serve a lot of our European customers from our East Coast data center as well. What we found actually is that for a lot of our European customers, the latency serving European customers from New Jersey is often better than the latency involved in serving from certain data centers within Europe, which is kind of an amazing thing.